Welcome to a very special episode of Battling with Bourbon.
I'm your host, Rockstar Mike Verdusco.
And I'm your host, Rockstar Johnny Nye. And today we are doing a very different, very special episode for Bourbon Heritage Month. And we are going to be talking about what got us into bourbon and what started us on this journey. And to help us today, we have a very special guest, our producer that's been doing everything behind the scenes to make this happen. The wonderful Producer Pam.
Producer Pam, baby. Woo!
Hi, guys.
Let's
give a warm welcome
everybody
to the magic behind the scenes who makes all the videos happen. We wouldn't be here without her, our producer, Pam.
I appreciate that, guys. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk about your journey now that you guys have posted some videos and some of your viewers have kind of gotten to know you a little bit. I kind of want to ask questions about how you got to like bourbon, because for those of you who don't know, I'm actually married to one of the co-hosts, Johnny Nye, and his, journey through the type of liquor and drinks he used to drink kind of is an interesting one. So I kind of wanted to talk about that. And then of course, ask Mike too, kind of how and why you got into bourbon, and ultimately that led to, the Battling with Bourbon YouTube channel. So you guys ready to jump right in?
Absolutely.
All right. So before we get started, let's tell everyone what we're drinking, because of course it wouldn't be a Battling with Bourbon video if we didn't drink some bourbon. So what are you guys drinking right now?
Right now we got a old school Russell's 10-year-old.
10-year, baby.
It's one of our
nice.
staples. It's a classic.
Some of the best bang for buck you'll ever buy.
Absolutely.
And I have Weller, because that's my favorite. It's my favorite go-to, I will say. Not my favorite bourbon, but my favorite go-to. So
Special
cheers.
reserve, right?
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. So first, just to kind of start before the bourbon happened for Johnny, I know when I first met you, you were a Mai Tai and a rum and Coke drinker. Which I think is hilarious.
Rum and Coke, Captain Morgan, motherfucker.
Captain Morgan all day.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess what made you be that kind of a drinker? Like, why'd you like the fruity and the sugary drinks back then?
To be honest, I'm not really sure. I think I enjoyed the vanillas that came out of Captain. It was just like when you first start drinking, you kind of get into like the more sugary bullshit kind of drinks, where it's like more fun, tropical, and the sugar kind of gives you an extra little Zupa energy while you're drinking. But it's to me now it's too sweet. It kind of shifted now to bourbon, because bourbon has sweetness without actually having sugar, which is a big component, which is really nice.
What did you used to drink, Mike?
So honestly, in my younger years, I didn't drink to drink, right? If you're drinking, there was a purpose. So, and that purpose honestly was to get fucked up, right? So, as weird as it sounds, I've always naturally been able to handle my hard liquor easier than I was able to handle my beer. So if I was looking to get jazzed up, honestly, it was a good IPA, it was a good Three Floyds. And that's what was my go-to at the time. I would do the beer flights, so to speak. And then after 3 beers, I'd be pretty toasted, enough to be like a Elijah Craig toasted barrel myself personally.
Yeah, for sure. I know when Johnny and I first met, so aside from the Mai Tai and the rum and Coke, we also used to go to a lot of breweries and do beer, tours and all that kind of stuff too. I was definitely a beer drinker, I would say, and wine was my go-to. But what kind of kicked this off, at least in my opinion, Johnny, correct me if I'm wrong, about a year into our relationship, I had went to, I did a solo trip to Ireland. And my Aunt Dawn actually told me, oh, you have to stop at the Jameson distillery when you're there.
Oh.
And I knew Jameson was an Irish whiskey, but I'd never really tried it or drank it before, totally out of my realm. So my last day in Ireland is what I did the Jameson distillery tour. And it was like at 11 o'clock in the morning, which I was not an early drinker at that time at all. So throughout the tour, they have you do a few different tastings and then you get a cocktail at the end. And the cocktail was Jameson ginger ale and lime. And I fell in love with it. So when I came back, Johnny and I went out on a date and we went to this Irish pub not too far from here. And I said, you have to try this Jameson ginger ale and lime. And then he kind of fell in love with it. And that became our drink. So anytime we would go out, we would always get an Irish whiskey with ginger ale, lime. And I think that kind of is how it started, because one night we were out with your cousins and she had a bullet bourbon. And that was, I think, the official first bourbon that kind of got you tied into all of this. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So then you started getting, I think, bourbon, ginger ale, and lime instead of the Jameson.
Yes, absolutely. And it was traditionally always Bullet from then on for a while. My brother had talked about Bullet because it came from a movie with Sylvester Stallone, and he like threw Bullet on the counter and he was like, well, do you have this? Well, then I'll pay $20 for the glass. And he was drinking Bullet bourbon in a movie. I don't even know what movie it was, but my brother told me about it. So I was like, well, hell, and my cousin's soon-to-be wife, Jamie, had a Bullet bourbon at the bar, and I just was like, well, I'll just try that in ginger ale and give it a shot. And so we kind of started there, and then it went to Bullet on Ice, and went to, ended up in different bourbons and neat.
Yeah. So what about your first bourbon, Mike? What was the first one that you kind of tried that kind of linked you into the bourbon world?
For sure. So for me, Northwest Indiana, born and raised, went to high school at Andrean, graduated 2004. Me and Johnny met at Andrean through being wrestling fans, right? So we've always been huge wrestling fans, but with Johnny being in the wrestling industry himself, in our adult years, very rarely were we able to actually link together and go to those wrestling shows with each other. So he usually went with his own group of like 13 different people, and I went to my own group with like 4 different people. And then eventually one year, what had happened is my group of people couldn't make it, and he had one person in his group that couldn't make it, and that afforded us the ability to meet up for an AEW All Out event over at which arena was that one? Would have been?
I think that was the
at the
Now
Schaumburg, yeah.
It used to be the Sears, whatever it was.
So at the Now Arena. So I meet up with him at the Now Arena. We get there a little early, and Rockstar Johnny over here has this bottle in the car, waiting for us. It's a Jefferson's, and at the time I don't know really anything about bourbon, for that matter. And then me and him killed this little bottle in his car, with me not knowing that the only way to obtain this bottle was to purchase a variety pack of like a 7 distillery experimental series within Jefferson. You fast forward a little bit, I start calling Johnny on the phone, asking him like, hey, I really enjoyed that. What should I be getting into, looking for myself? And, he's informing me that, really start with the Russell's 10-year, because bang for your buck, you're not going to find a 10-year-old bourbon in the under 50 market unless it's this Russell's over here. So I knew to pick this one up, and actually I was finding it at Myers at the time for right around $25. So it was a steal. So I freaking bought like 6 bottles right out of the chute just to have a supply. But when I went to a small liquor store, I actually had noticed that the pint of Bullet was more expensive than the pint of Russell's. So I grabbed the Bullet just thinking, hey, it's more expensive, so it should be better, so to speak. So Bullet was what my first was on my own drinking by myself neat, which through this conversation, I'm finding out that it was actually Johnny's first on his own. So how freaking coincidental is that his on his own was Bullet and mine on my own was his Bullet. But it's the Wild Turkey family that kind of marries us all together, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of, jumping into the Bullet distillery. So because Johnny was such a huge fan of Bullet at the time, and that kind of took over his drink for his birthday or Christmas, I can't remember which one it was. I had gotten you a tour on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, and the main one was the Bullet distillery that, we were really excited to see. But at some point, I feel like between me getting you that gift And then the actual date of the tour, you started dabbling like within 3 months into Buffalo Trace products all of a sudden. And I think, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys are more into it now than I am. Your palates have surpassed what I can even handle, I feel like. But I feel like that's a natural progression. I feel like Buffalo Trace ends up being kind of the first one people go towards. I could be totally wrong because of the Blantons and the bottle and, you know, even like the John Wick references with Blantons and how popular that got. I felt like that was just a natural progression into it being kind of your favorite for a while.
It was the thrill of the hunt. So Buffalo Trace does a really, really good job at making each of their products rare. Even traditional Buffalo Trace is not easily found as much as, you know, say a regular Bullet or a Russell's 10.
Sure.
But they do a wonderful job of getting that FOMO where like you feel like Blanton's is the best thing that's ever existed because I can't find it. And so that you go on this hunt trying to get it, and then you taste it and it is really good. It's smooth as can be. But, you know, then you get in that market where you're kind of in that intro level where you want smooth. And so you're doing Weller Special Reserves and you're doing Blanton's and you're doing even to another extent, E.H. Taylor, small batch. And those are very smooth, even keeled bourbons. But then at some point you start to branch into
out.
other flavors.
Yeah.
You know, you want something more.
Now, to expand on that, for my present as being one of this man's groomsmen over here, you know, he gifted me a Weller Green Label Special Reserve, and I happened to sit next to John's dad, Terry, over at the pre-rehearsal dinner, and John's dad was like, "Oh, he gave you the good one." Well, I thought that was just something polite to say. Like, of course, yeah, he gave me the good one. So I killed that bottle back home with a friend, and I go looking for that bottle. Nowhere to be found. Like, John tells me it's only a $30 bottle, don't worry about it. But what he didn't tell me was the aftermarket, right? You know, $50, $100, and these people are freaking crazy. And little to be known, it's just nowhere to be had. Yeah. So I drive around consistently for like the next 4 to 6 months trying to replace this Green Label Weller with zero
success. Yeah. So would you say after Bullet for you, Mike, was Buffalo Trace also kind of like the first distillery you branched into?
Absolutely. I did have a Russell's 10 years sitting at the home on the shelf, and I did have a normal Bullet Express sitting at home on the shelf, but I did find myself trying to replace that Green Label Weller for about 4 to 6 months. And I had no idea until I re-talked to him. But what ended up happening was I didn't know that this liquor store could charge X amount and that liquor store could charge Y amount. So I ended up paying $80 to replace that Green Label Weller. And I called him. I was like, "Bro, why in the hell did you give me an $80 bottle for free? Like, holy crap." And he's like, "Oh boy, you didn't pay $80 for that bottle." And I was like, "Yes, I bought 2. No. So here I am, 160 invested in Green Label Weller for 2 bottles. You know, then come to find out, I never even had the courage to admit to him, but I had also ended up buying an antique 107 for like $180, not knowing that was like a $50 to $80 bottle in the wild.
Wow. That's pretty funny. I mean, and I think though that's as funny as that is now because of the knowledge you guys have about it. I feel like that's common though too when people are first branching out. And in my opinion, I would totally pay $80 for a bottle of Weller because I love it so much. It's probably my number one favorite. But now we can find it, you know, more often than not.
And I honestly made that same mistake with my first bottle of Blanton's.
That's what I mean. I feel like that's a common thing.
It is like once you know, you don't make that mistake. But if you don't know and you find it, it's like, oh, I found it. I found it. I got to get it. And then it's like, oh, crap. I paid twice what it's worth or 3 times what it's worth. You know, you don't know.
And that's why you found it.
Yeah, exactly.
Part 2 coming at you tomorrow.